Hey there, everybody, and welcome to the first BMPodcast of the fall 2018 semester. This week, we are going to be talking about the documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor, which kind of talks about the life and story of Fred Rogers, who, if anybody didn't really know, there were definitely people who didn't watch it. There were kind of like two versions of it. There was the original in the 60s, and then they brought it back in the 80s, which is like the version that I watched growing up and saw. And that was when he had the colored sweaters, if that rings any bells for anybody who doesn't know about it. So did you ever watch Mr. Rogers, or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood growing up?
Yes, I remember, I don't remember actual content of the episode, but I remember watching him and like the train going around the city and like him putting on his sweater because it was always like a different color, and I remember different parts of it, but I don't have like a specific memory about the content of it, which now that having watched the documentary, I feel like I would like to go back and watch it to appreciate the content a little bit more, but I don't know.
It can be, I'm not gonna lie, it can be hard to watch if you go back and try to watch it, because they talk about it in the documentary, but like the show's really slow.
Yeah.
And that's like, it's kind of weird when you first watch it, because all the characters, like their lines are delivered very like uniformly and everything is very set, but that's the point.
Yeah, and like I liked how in the documentary they talk about why they do that, because they talk about how Mr. Rogers, he really liked having silence because it allowed children to kind of process and think about what was happening. And so I thought that was really neat to incorporate that, because instead of having constant like
stimulation.
Yes, constant stimulation, it was giving children a time to kind of like calm down and think about things, because they addressed really important issues within the show, and so it gave the children a little bit of time to kind of be like, okay, yes, I need this time to kind of calm down and reflect on what it is that I'm learning or thinking about from this episode. And so I like how he used, I haven't watched the episode, so I probably won't like it anymore, but like I like how he thought about the silence and the space within the episode, and it was very
Yeah, I'm curious.
detailed.
I don't know if I would actually like the show. Like, I definitely like the message that he had and the message that the show had. I don't know if I would actually enjoy watching it, though.
Yeah.
I would totally give it to my kids, though.
Oh, yeah. Probably wouldn't watch it with them, but I'd be like, this is great. Hope you get some sort of enjoyment out of it.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
What else we got? There were some interesting kind of points that resonated. I don't know how much stuff we can talk about with spoilers. I mean, there's definitely, since it is a documentary, spoilers like aren't as much of a thing, but like there's definitely emotional moments where you don't want to like.
So many emotional moments. I mean, I think, especially in the time that he produced this show, he was one of the more progressive figures because he handled topics that were previously not really touched upon, and they were very subtle too, like there was a protest about people sharing a pool, whites and blacks both getting in was a huge issue. Apparently, I think it was back in the 60s whenever this episode came out, but I'm not positive. But I remember this episode came out, and Mr. Rogers, he felt compelled to, be like, no, like your color doesn't matter, race doesn't really compute in just any sort of, it's socially constructed, he's not saying that it actually means anything. And so he invites the police officer in to wash his feet, and that's a huge statement.
Officer Clemens, who don't know, is a character on the show. He's black. So
yeah, I think that was really nice. And then also, he talks a lot about death, and after 9/11 happened, he kind of went into that and talked, right, I think?
Yeah. He did do like a short thing on 9/11, but the show had already been finished.
Yeah, and so like I think it's important that he goes and he brings these really important issues and gives them to children to make them digestible. And like after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he was like, what does this word mean? You're hearing this a lot, and it just, this is what it means, and so he's giving children a space in which to learn about the issues that they may not actually know what they mean, but he's teaching them, so like, yes, they're hearing about it, but they don't understand, they wouldn't know what the word assassinated means, so he's explaining it to them within the context of a children's show, and giving them this free space to kind of figure out their emotions and figure out the world, I think that was really important and progressive, because it's very rare to have that, even today. I mean, today it's just overstimulus with like superheroes and like colors and everything, but he just really took that time to make sure that children were developing,
Yeah. One of the things that I really enjoyed about it was that they did show a lot of the stuff about his life, kind of like his shortcomings and like his
Yeah.
personal struggles. And I thought that was pretty cool because like when people didn't know if he was always that kind of like wholesome guy on and off camera, and it kind of like they're like, yes, that is him to an extent, but there were issues, and they kind of talk about how the characters help represent
Him.
him, and it's like like for example, King Friday is kind of like a dark side Mr. Rogers, if that's a thing that exists. And then
What's the tiger?
Yeah, Daniel the tiger.
Daniel,
yeah.
and like how that was like his actual like persona.
Yeah, that's like his shy like.
Yeah.
That's like kind of represents all of his insecurities.
Yeah,
So.
and it was also really neat to see like because no one ever tells a story about how Mr. Rogers became Mr. Rogers, you know. But it talked about as a child, he was bullied and picked on, you know. And so I like how it kind of shows this is how this man.
It explains his mindset.
Yeah, you know, and I think that was really important to see. And, you know, how also publicity kind of affected him in his relationships, and he felt like he always had to be turned on, you know. But I really appreciate how the documentary kind of gave you a deeper look into him and his very thoughtful and detail-oriented life.
Yeah.
So.
I would say detail-oriented, and detail-oriented is a pretty good way to go about it. Something they kind of discuss about the show is that everything was very, very intentional. Even though sometimes it maybe like the words are a little corny or like could seem like they're making up, like they talk about in the documentary, there was like, no, Fred wrote the scripts very specifically and like to get across certain themes, and especially with the songs.
Yeah, he had a heavy hand in all of the production process, every part of it. You know, he wanted it done a certain way, and it's because he wanted children to get certain things from the episodes, you know, and so I think it was really important for him to have that heavy hand. Otherwise, it might not have turned out to be the Mr. Rogers neighborhood that we grew up with.
Yeah.
So.
One thing I do think is interesting, and they bring it up kind of near the end of the documentary, or they talk about it a little bit in the beginning, but it's that the nice guy on TV like doesn't exist anymore, and I think that's kind of why the documentary was made, is because they were like, oh, the media is very. What would be a good word? I don't know. The media is very extravagant, I guess if that would make sense. There's not really the guy who kind of has the slower pace or the different perspective, and I think it's part of why they were pushing for the movie to come out now, because I mean, the show's been over for like more than 20 years. It's been almost 30 years. They've had a while to make a Fred Rogers documentary.
Yeah.
So
I think one thing that they really, like one reason that they made it was because of the way things are right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a lot of high tensions, and it seems like a lot of things, like whenever you go and look at the news, it's like people attacking one another, or this very like strong voice yelling at you, or, you know, when you look at children's programs, it's a lot of colors, a lot of actions, and, you know, typically it can be something that's more like superheroes, if there's a little bit of violence that's introduced, you know, and, you know, there's a big question in society now of like, should our children be watching violent shows and playing violent video games, because does that transition to them being a violent person, you know? Which we're not going to talk about that, but that's a whole different podcast in its own. But I think this show would be valued nowadays to some people who need that sort of slower pace feeling. And right now, I think we all kind of need that time to kind of, you know, figure out where do we stand, because a lot of things are happening in the world right now. I need a new Mr. Rogers show right now, just for me and my college lifestyle, and like figuring out what is happening in the world. But
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think if people wanted it to exist, it would. I think they were more just commenting that kind of thing just doesn't exist in the current media, and I honestly don't think it will. Like something that slow paced. I mean, that stuff exists. Like PBS, there's still plenty of good programming on PBS. That's not like a surprise to anyone. It's just people, not the kind of thing people freak out about or notice too much.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there might someday be a thing for the nice guy in the media. I mean, it's kind of a weird example, and also, I don't know, an interesting example, but I guess Ninja from Fortnite, that's like a weird thing, but he
I don't play
is
a lot
like
of Fortnite, so I don't
or,
know.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna get.
I'm not too surprised, but basically he's like the biggest Fortnite personality. A lot of people know who he is, and he'll make it a point to like do charity events and like talk about bullying stuff, and it's definitely not the same because it's like this dude who's yelling at video games, but he does try to be like wholesome and kind of like have good messages. So that stuff exists. I think it's just not as concentrated anymore. Like there isn't the Mr. Rogers guy, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in the media.
Oh yeah, I mean it still exists, but it's just, I feel like you have to be looking for it to an extent.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, they even in the documentary, I think it was look for the people who are helping. There will always be people helping. And it's
Yeah. Oh, I cried so much in that documentary.
Yeah, there were I probably had about 3 big cry moments.
I think I had like the last half of it, basically. I was just like, oh my god.
Yeah, no, the first time you see it, there's kind of like the halfway point where they go like, all right, this is enough autobiography stuff. Let's talking about some of his morals, and you're like, oh my god,
I know.
he was just
a good person.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, it was so moving though, because he really just seemed like such a genuine, nice guy. That he really wanted to make a change in the world, and like a positive change,
Yeah.
And I think, I'm gonna get political here a little bit, but I think with like the Donald Trump era, it's nice to have this moment where there's not hatred, there's love, and there's a man that's welcoming and trying to show all people want the same thing. All people deserve to be loved and welcomed and treated respectfully, and we all deserve to have emotions and be able to feel okay in them, not just girls, guys should also feel comfortable enough to be able to be sensitive in their masculinity, and not have it be like a whole thing. There's just a lot that's going on in the world right now that I think this show addressed and was like more loving towards. And with the Donald Trump era, it's just hate everywhere, And so I think this is important in that respect. And watching that in this moment and feeling like the world's going to an end, everyone hates one another. There's not a whole lot of like coming together, and you have the white supremacists, and you have women being treated horribly in every environment, and it's just there's a lot of disrespect and not fair treatment, and it's nice to be able to take 2 hours or so and look at this documentary and be like, okay, it was there then, I know it's there now, I just need to be looking for it. Like you said, there's always good people who look for them. And so I really think it was beautiful to show, it doesn't matter what race you are, what religion you are, what gender you are, what sexuality you choose to identify with or pursue in romantic relationships. I think it's important to show that and be accepting of others. And I don't know, I really liked it.
Yeah, no, it was definitely a great documentary. It's been a little while since I've watched one where it's kind of like the point is more to be not informative, but kind of have more like moral themes.
Yeah, emotional themes.
Yeah, because there's a lot of documentaries where it's just like, I don't know, I'm trying to think.
Here are the facts.
Yeah, or here are the facts, but it's just like they'll just present stuff in an interesting way. This is more like, it's more, it starts up more of an internal monologue. Kind of makes you think more inward.
Yeah, and then also growing up with him too, and like remembering him, and then having him die. Spoiler alert, if anyone didn't know. But and like being like, such a good egg, and he's gone. But he's not forgotten, I guess, which was kind of weird to say it like that. But I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think what else we got going on in that documentary. It was cool that you got to see a lot. They interviewed a lot of people.
They did.
It was a majority of the documentary is interviews, but I think that's probably a good thing because it was kind of you got to see the impact that he had on people and like kind of how they would tell the stories, their perspectives on things.
Yeah, they had interviews, and they not just with the people that were on set, but also his family, and they also went and had footage of him giving interviews back in the day, like talking about his show. I thought that was really neat. And one thing that I absolutely loved was the animation, where they had Daniel the tiger, and it was like it was him, and then later on they talk about how that tiger is his persona,
Yeah, I think they did the animation stuff whenever they were talking about anything that was kind of conceptual or like his morals or his beliefs.
Yes, and I loved that. It drew me in, and it had like an adult sort of childlike feel to it, if that makes sense, And it was able to clearly illustrate these ideas that they were trying to get across about like what he believed, but show it to you in a way that's like it's relatable because you feel the emotions, like you feel what it's talking to you about, I just love the animation and how it brought those ideas to life basically, and all the interviews and the footage that they got of him.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of interesting that they are making a documentary now about someone whose life was very heavily documented. Like any documentaries are gonna be interesting in the future because
our lives are so documented.
Yeah, and his wasn't even like that much. Like they talk about it for someone who like was on television. He hated TV for the most part. Like he didn't watch it. He didn't care about the camera stuff. He just knew it was a way to get his message across.
Yeah.
So like outside of the set, there wasn't too much footage of him, or like they didn't have that. There was a little bit of like home video stuff of him talking a little bit.
Or like an interview with like a news station where he came in to talk about like, yes, I do it for the children, you know. Have you seen Jim Carrey's new, I think it's a TV show?
Jim and Andy? Or
No.
Okay.
It's called Kidding, based off of the trailer. It seems to be sort of closely related to Mr. Rogers. They haven't come out and said that it's directly related or anything, but you can kind of see that it's this person who gives off like a Mr. Rogers vibe and kind of like has that, and it's about this man that Jim Carrey plays who has a television show for children, and it's kind of about all the publicity and the television and stuff, and you know, constantly having to be turned on and like be this persona that he's presented on TV, and like the ramifications of that within his personal life. And it's really neat to see like how there's this man who's always supposed to be sort of loving and calm and just, you know, the persona that he gives off of Mr. Rogers kind of. It's a similar vibe, but it's difficult to see like, that transition because, you know, in your home life, you know, or your personal life, that may not be the person that you represent on the outside. And so I think this is going to be really interesting to see Jim Carrey's project, Kidding, and how it kind of correlates with this documentary and with what we know of Mr. Rogers, because it has that vibe. So you mentioned about his personality and how like people talked about that was how he was just in his personal life too. Like he was just always that person that he gave off on the show. But it was interesting seeing the documentary too, though, because they talk about how he sort of had these other personas that he would give off in the puppets. You know, like King Friday. You know, he obviously has a different personality, and that was kind of Mr. Rogers. The way that Mr. Rogers got out different emotions, you know, or different things that necessarily weren't on brand or weren't necessarily on brand. And so it's interesting to see like he was constantly on, but he was able to use his puppets or these little figures that he would use as a way of getting those emotions out.
For example, when the example they give in the documentary is that when he would get upset or like we kind of say something that was not Mr. Rogers-y, he would do the voice. Oh, what's the name of the witch? I can't remember her name.
Oh, I don't remember.
But there is a witch character, and so he would do her voice as to kind of show like, hey, this is not particularly...
Didn't he do that at the dinner table one
time?
Or
something, yeah. It's like not necessarily wholesome or polite, but he just felt like he had to say it. So, I mean, it probably waned on him, but all the people in the interview are constantly like, yeah, that's how he was in real life the whole time. And I'm sure that's not the case. Like there was probably times where he snapped, but I would totally believe that it was almost the entire time that he was like that. Yeah, so that show will be coming out. Kidding, I believe it's called. It'll be coming out on, or I think it is out on Showtime. I've seen it.
Yeah, I think it's out now.
If you have like the student Spotify thing, you can get it for
Hulu
free.
and
Maybe
Spotify.
I'll watch it. I do like Jim Carrey movies. Recently watched Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Really, really good. But yeah, no, that'd be great.
He's a really great dramatic actor, which does not matter for this podcast.
Yeah, but yeah, just a quick little Jim Carrey tangent before we kind of wrap it up. I think we've had a nice little discussion about Won't You Be My Neighbor, the documentary about the life and kind of the ideals of Fred Rogers.
Thanks for listening to the BM podcast for the first episode. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.